He's previously the urban in residence at Urban X, BMW's Minis Urban Tech Accelerator, and the Director of Applied Research at New Cities. Greg is also the two-time Jeopardy champion. I did not know that. Wow, there we go. And the only human to go undefeated against IBM's pioneering artificial intelligence, Watson. Yeah, that deserves a round of applause. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Greg Lindsay.
Thank you so much, Alex. So, you know the drill. When we get to Q&A at the end of my talk, you will phrase it in the form of an answer. I will respond in the form of a question. We'll go from there, kind of thing. But no, it's a pleasure to be here. It's particularly, thank you, Alex, for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you all. I'm here, of course, to talk about the future. Not just the future of retail, but the future of cities and technology and climate and all these sort of mega trends that are combining to shape at least the rest of this decade, maybe into the 2040s from there. And it's particularly a pleasure to be back here in the Mid-Atlantic region, in Maryland and DC and Northern Virginia, where really America's urban future for the last 3 to 4 decades has been built. Joel Garreau writing the book Edge City about how we basically built out Tysons as a prototype for much of America. I think a lot of the prototypes of the future of America will be built here as well. But speaking of future prototypes, I'm in the foresight business, and rarely are we successful in creating a vision that will shape America as Patrick Geddes did at Futurama in 1939-1940, the World's Fair. I'm wearing a pin right now. 75 million Americans during the depths of the Depression went through there on a Disney-esque ride and received a button that said, "I have seen the future." This, of course, is where we laid out the vision of the post-war suburban landscape that we would build, and they are still building. And of course, just a few years after that, at the end of the war, we started to see the ground literally being broken, all those kinds of developments. Levittown, famously America's first mass-produced suburb, with the kind of customization of pre-selected set of homes, and imagining the kind of pleasures that we would put in there, the hard goods, the soft goods, what that post-war post-depression landscape would look like. Now, I bring up Levittown. I've always loved this sort of idea of this, and of course, a few years after this, Victor Gruen, of course, would invent the shopping mall as we know it in Northfield in Minnesota. So all these innovations in design and urbanism coming out at the same time. But I thought about it because recently Bloomberg did a fascinating piece where they looked at Levittown today, which is definitely not the urban future. And they did a direct comparison of Nassau County, New York, which is the Long Island suburbs, Robert, Moses, and highways and things, and compared it with Nassau County, Florida, which is the Florida just north of Jacksonville, including Amelia Island and the beautiful homes there, and looking at the kind of compact, small-town urban landscapes that people have been moving to during the pandemic versus the kind of sprawling, auto-driven suburbia there. This ongoing, decades-in-the-making return to something that feels, if not like a small town, but at least more like a main street that combines all these kinds of mixed amenities together. But more important to that is, and I think this is the chart that Bloomberg had, which is, I think, going to define the next 7 years, is Nassau, Florida is willing to build housing. Everything comes back to housing, and housing starts. As we see this affordability crisis, which shows no signs of ending, is only getting worse, as we saw after yesterday with Chairman Powell's comments on interest rates and how they're rising. I am not an economist, and I will leave that to the economist speaker. But we can sort of see here these pressures on where do we build and what do we build and how do we basically build mixed use around it is going to become even more acute. And the places that have spent the last few decades fighting against that kind of growth and fighting against the future to keep that, those are the places that are going to be left behind. Nassau, New York, and neighboring Suffolk County, the Chicago suburbs where I grew up and being left behind, and so on and so on. So it's places like this, and this is why I've been coming to Northern Virginia and the Mid-Atlantic region for years to see this kind of new mixed-use future being built. Places like Mosaic. I was here in 2019 before the pandemic to see places like Mosaic, to see places like, the developments in Loudoun County. One of my best friends is working in development out there, looking at the developments along the Silver Line, classic transit-oriented development. And of course, I've worked with folks at Howard Hughes as well, as they sort of look at how do they move on beyond their giant suburban mega projects like, Columbia and Summerlin and the Woodlands into rethinking more dense infill and thinking about how to build communities. This is the future of America, at least certainly the future that I hope we get to see. So the future, of course, does not always come right at once. As someone in the foresight business, I am duty-bound to recite to you William Gibson's, the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. If we know where to look, we can see fragments and pieces and weak signals from that future and assemble the kinds of stories that we want to tell. So, just quickly, sort of like some of the macro things here. When we talk about, the future is not evenly distributed, neither is American population post-pandemic. After decades of declining mobility, by which I mean Americans willing to move, here's a great stat for you, we'll see how true it is. 80% of Americans live within 18 miles of their mothers. How many of you in this room live within 18 miles of your mothers? Can I get a show of hands? All right, yeah, about 80% of the room. I always love how that never fails. But we did see actually unprecedented social mobility and geographic mobility here. That big flight out of the high-cost coastal and urban metros in California, Illinois, and New York, of course, into the Sun Belt where there was more housing affordability. As you can see here, the Mid-Atlantic has been a bit of a mixed bag. And according to several metrics, the Mid-Atlantic is a bit of a mixed bag. Business formation here is going great. I just pulled this slide out of various U.S. Census data. The new American Community Survey results are just starting to come out. So we can see here that, when it comes to creating new businesses and economic growth, the region's been excelling. But it has also suffered a bit of, if not brain drain, well, actually brain drain too, I'll get to that in a moment, but also wealth drain as part of the much ballyhooed trend to move to lower tax, lower cost states in the Sun Belt. But to me, what's most worrisome is for large metros across the United States is the fact that, we of course saw blue collar and service workers move as because of these affordability pressures. But now we're starting to see this giant urban bleed out of college graduates, and Metro Washington is no exception to that. Post-pandemic acceleration after a turnaround. And if you recall, 10 years ago, you had people like Richard Florida, my occasional colleague, calling about the triumph of the city at Glazer at Harvard because of that huge inswell of college grads into places like Metro Washington. Well, during the pandemic, I wrote a whole report on where those people would go to raise their kids, and the answer is not unaffordable urban centers. This is driving, I think, in many ways, the rise of these kinds of new mixed-use projects as millennials, the most stressed generation here as they reach their peak childbearing years, are looking for the kind of districts that keep some of the urban amenities that they love while actually having more of the affordability and space and so on. And we'll see. We've got some great slides from Redfin on this coming up. But yeah, we also see again the fact that there was this whole surge towards the Sun Belt during the pandemic. What I think is interesting has been the revenge of the East. Now we see like the boom towns, Zoom towns out west, Boise and Tahoe and others are now seeing, partly because of their huge peaks, depreciation, while underappreciated communities in the East and the Northeast are now seeing the sort of rise back. So this tide that's splashing back and forth across America when it comes to housing affordability. And then the final trend of that is what Nicholas Bloom at Stanford has described as the donut effect. And this is, we'll talk about this in my first section here as I talk about work and housing and retail and so on and so on. This is, of course, the effects of remote work and what we've seen in terms of home prices and where people have gone. In New York, it's the surge of people into the Hudson Valley, buying their second homes before they can even buy their first homes, to basically work from there and commute into the city when necessary. But when you delve into it, you can see these donuts are everywhere across the American South. They're concentrated around DC and Northern Virginia, but you can also see big blobs where Atlanta and Charlotte would be, and Nashville, the Texas Triangle, and so forth, as people seek housing affordability on the peripheries of those regions. And then finally, the big trend, this is the one that should be, I think, ultimately cheering many of the room which is, of course, that after that big urban tide in the early 2010s, we've now seen this faster growth in suburbia, for population, for retail, for office. Office market in suburbs is outperforming for the first time in a long time. And this is a slide from a much discussed McKinsey report that came out on this about really what is the long-term upshot when it comes to all these trends we've talked about. And the growth towards suburbanism is real. I love that Beijing is this insane outlier at the bottom, by the way, but everyone else moving towards more space in the suburbs. So as a starting point, let's talk about work and the future of work, particularly white-collar knowledge work, and particularly in a region like this where, of course, so much of the federal government has checked out and not checked back in. We see, of course, in cities across the country, these kinds of empty offices. Will they ever be refilled? The answer to an extent is no. Obviously the federal government has its own ability to motivate employees in DC, but this is, again, Nicholas Bloom research to show that, yeah, we have seen a leveling off. Remote work has achieved its equilibrium after these last 3.5 years at about 30%. So this is interesting because, of course, that's, on one hand, that's half of what it was during the peak of the pandemic. On the other half, 30% is something like a sixtupling of what it was prior to the pandemic. So anytime you increase something by a factor of 6, you're going to have massive permanent ramifications. One of which is the fact that, according to the much followed Kastle Work Index, and if you know Kastle, it's only an index of 10 cities and only follows badge data, but it shows that only for 1 week, effectively, in the last year, has more than 50% of office workers been present in the office across its 10 cities. DC Metro, if you can see it there in light yellow, it's exactly square, right below the top 10 average, almost square in the middle of them. And so as you can see, over the last, all these past years, it's not coming back. There's the big rebound isn't there. And we see this in other measures as well. I think it's interesting. So Pret, by the way, one of the most interesting indicators of footfall traffic is the Pret Index. Pret a Manger actually releases incredibly granular football data and partners with Bloomberg to release it. So this is their CEO, Peno Christos, who's basically, you can see there in Washington, it's one of the worst performing markets they have, where it's absolutely crushed. Pret tends to do a little bit better than office check-ins, but there it's at half of what it was prior to the pandemic because of all those federal workers being missing. And I think in a foreshadowing of what we'll talk about in the retail section, he's making a massive bet on suburbia. He's unveiled this month Club Pret, where you can basically, instead of popping in and grabbing a coffee and maybe a sandwich at your lunch hour and dashing back to your office, you can now subscribe annually to Club Pret and get 5 free coffees a day and 20% off purchases while you're there. So making this bet, you're going to spend a lot longer dwell time in your new third place in one of the suburban locations that they're opening across America and in London. And again, office space, it's interesting that JLL came out with the fact that, for one of the first times, I think in decades, we've seen negative net absorption of office space. The signs are here, all those companies that held off in the pandemic and immediate post-pandemic are now re-signing leases, but they're cashing in for smaller spaces. So, 10 million square feet moving out of the market. And I'm sure folks in this room know better than anyone here, because of course, Amazon HQ2, the most hotly contested beauty contest of my lifetime when it came to site selection. I think my hometown of Kankakee, Illinois, by the way, offered to set up a 65,000 acre free trade zone and build them an airport, which was kind of amazing. The third Chicago airport. But instead, of course, the booby prize going to Northern Virginia, and of course the pause that has ensued. And Amazon, like many tech companies, has paused multiple offices. It's still claiming it's going to create 25,000 jobs in Bellevue, Washington, and create the jobs here in Arlington, and create 5,000 jobs in Nashville, but the office footprints for all of those are currently on pause. So what does that mean here as we see these tech employers reevaluate what it means for that? At the very least, it means that they are trying to understand what these new patterns of hybrid work should be and how they should be structured. And at worst, they will decide that you are going to internalize their real estate costs into your home. But there's a very good reason why companies should have people back in the office. And this, to me, is where I've fallen out in this entire debate. It's pretty obvious why individual workers would prefer to work from home, having that time back, lessening their commutes. Obviously, that lack of compensation for a commute is an interesting test case. We'll see how it works out in Europe, where under French law, for example, you are required to pay for commutes. So figuring out that commuting shed. But from a company standpoint, it's one of these where we're going to start to see that while productivity, of course, has gone up, and while we're seeing some worker satisfaction scores go up, I think in the long run it's going to be disastrous for companies, particularly for their innovation aspects and understanding how they process new ideas. So, for example, this is Hewlett and Packard, Jim Hewlett and Bill Packard, the little fathers of Silicon Valley. Their garage is now a museum. And they famously managed Hewlett Packard back in the day by walking around. They would literally talk to the various engineering teams and build a map in their head of how everyone was working, something you could do in the early days. Of course, over time, they retired. Their CEO who replaced them 25 years ago implemented this. I love this frankness. If HP knew what HP knows, it would be 3 times more productive. Meaning management had completely lost track of what was actually in the heads of employees. The same phenomenon that we're seeing with remote work. Now, early in the pandemic, again, probably 3 months in, as you can see, June 2020 data, Microsoft did this amazing paper they put out in Nature where they captured communications of all 61,000 then employees. And this is very technical, but what it shows is that things like weak ties and number of added ties and shared time with added ties, the people in your organization who are not direct reports, they are not your close friends or family members, the kinds of people whom you occasionally cross paths with, touch base with, share leads on ideas and jobs, etc., that was falling off. Microsoft was, as an organization, was suffering massive brain damage. And so was every company during the pandemic. My friend Ben Weber, who I worked with on this, did a great paper for HBR on about the video game industry. You'd think the companies that were best at building massive virtual worlds would be best suited to remote work. As it turns out, none of them were. You could measure it in all the delays, costly delays to their massive game franchises that happened in 2020 and 21. The only companies that did not suffer that were the Japanese video game companies that early in the pandemic stayed in the office. And there's a control group because some of them went home. And you can see here these kinds of things which get dismissed as hearsay or as just sob stories, but they're true. This idea of touch bases, short meetings, being able to bring people together, that is what created the cohesion for them to work together. And I think that if we're going to actually make cohesive arguments to get people back in offices, we're actually going to have to give agency and power and create convincing reasons to those people why they should be there. Like, not micromanage, you need to be in the office because I need to see you as your boss, but you need to be back in the office because it will make you better at your job, or because this person has the solution to the problem you've been trying to solve. And that is going to require, interestingly enough, a number of different approaches, one of which is to basically strap sensors onto everyone. So Ben, I know him from this, what they're wearing around their necks, they're sociometric badges developed at MIT. They listen to everything you say, they measure where you go, they use infrared to see exactly who you're talking to. And that's not the most dystopian part yet. The most dystopian part is that what you say doesn't actually matter. It doesn't actually listen to the content of your discussion. What it measures is how you talk to people. Are you hoarding the conversation? Are you actually letting other people talk? And then using that to build basically maps of organizations to understand who really matters. Not the boss, but who the secret dark matter in organizations actually is. And there's fascinating academic research on this and how it affects companies. But just to show one example of like how it could be, this is separate work that my friend Brandon Klein did when he was, he's a member of a consulting firm now called The Difference. He was the Chief Collaboration Officer of United Health Group in Minneapolis. But here what you're seeing is some work they did for the young global leaders of Davos, the inheritors of the world. I was there in Tokyo for their final exercise in 2016, which had, people like Brian Chesky of Airbnb and Chelsea Clinton and Paris, Ivanka Trump was there. And as you can see there that, in this case, what they did was, I don't know if I can go back again. In any case, you can see that what they did is they took a bunch of disconnected networkers, and through a combination of using artificial intelligence, social network analysis, and high-end human facilitation, they bound them all together. I watched as they created new nonprofit initiatives together that seemed like a spontaneous gathering of people. It was actually part of a really ambitious effort to bring them together. And what's fascinating to me is like this function doesn't exist in most corporations or in most offices. There's no one there to tell you how and to help you work better, other than basically processing paperwork or maybe unjamming the printer. But if we can create this function of someone who's in charge of this, an air traffic controller for orgs, maybe we can start to unlock some of that value, and then we can start to think about who really should work together and when, and achieve a hybrid form of work that actually delivers lots of value. With Ben in 2014, I wrote a whole piece about basically imagining what these future office networks could be like. We examined new typologies, and 10 years later, here we are. We were motivated by this great quote by Bill Joy, one of the founders of Silicon Valley, founded Sun Microsystems, one of the greatest programmers who ever lived. No matter who you are, most of the smartest people work for someone else. This usually gets translated as to why you should fight the war for talent and hire as many people as you can, what Facebook and others did during the pandemic, and then only to lay them off a little bit later. But what we thought about is how can you create offices and work environments where you can work alongside some of those smart people, even if you aren't drawing the same paychecks. This investment, this kind of new type of third places. And we can talk about WeWork, which is of course desperately trying to restructure itself into this form. We can talk about places like what I think is interesting as an example is New Lab out of Brooklyn. Just as a side of this, New Lab is a dedicated space for clean tech companies. And it's Climate Week right now in New York City, so the town is full of people like this. But what New Lab does is it brings together not just startups, not just an incubator in this, that are working on solving climate challenges, but it also brings huge companies like Verizon and Ford and others to come there and help gather up those startups and create ad hoc consulting arms to help them solve them. And I think that's really fascinating here, this idea that you can bring together multiple tenants under one roof, bring in outside firms as well, and use that collective brain power to solve challenges. How do you take the actual physical office space and turn it into an accelerator for new ideas and creating new value? This is the kind of skill set that I think basically offices are going to have to develop. And whether that is a revamped WeWork, whether that's someone like Industrious now, which of course is avoiding the WeWork problem by moving into directly working with landlords, et cetera. I also think it's interesting that with Industrious is that some of their locations are fascinating. The Dallas Farmers Market there. Not just putting it in the random Class B office space they were able to sign a cheap lease for during, in the aftermath of the financial crisis, but really thinking about those high-value, high-foot traffic third places. Where do people actually want to be? So we're gonna have a lot to do on this front. We're gonna have to think intrinsically about managing people and managing value and not just managing of space. And so but if we can crack that, if we can figure out how to basically use that as a way to attract people back, then we're on our way to revitalizing things post-pandemic. So housing, I want to talk about this because housing really is everything. And this is an amazing slide that just came out from Redfin. It really shows you like the complete grab bag of American motivations in terms of people who are now moving. So let's go through it quickly. Want more space, of course, don't we all? We'll get into that. To be with or nearer to family, 80% of that. Lower overall cost of living, of course. Better deal on a home is part of that. And this is where I think it's interesting. To live in an area better aligned with my views on social issues. It's true, America's political polarization playing out ever so slowly in residential real estate as well. For lower taxes, kind of part of the political polarization, frankly, along with concern for safety crime. But there you go, to want better weather, we've seen that push as well. Never underestimate America's thirst for better weather, but that might come back to haunt them, as I'll discuss in a little bit. And I think the most interesting one there, and this is the one that Redfin led with, is where is it, 10%? I have to move back due to a return to work policy. There's some interesting anecdotes of people taking multi-$100,000 losses on the homes they bought, where finally the return to work is finally biting back. And they're only 8.4%, which I'll get to, is concern for impact of climate change. So these are what's motivating us now. Now the space reason is pretty interesting, even as we've seen, of course, that due to American demography, the average household size in terms of number of people is shrinking. And yet, even in an environment of ruinously high interest rates, we're seeing that home builders are actually adding more bedrooms. The reason, of course, is a lot of remote work. So you can see here that actually, even during this tumultuous time, that basically the number of large single-family homes is surging. Now, this is where it starts to get interesting because, of course, who's buying a 4-bedroom house in this economy? Well, the answer, until very, very recently actually, was, of course, institutional interests and companies like, of course, Invitation Homes and American Homes for Rent, AMH. Those, of course, as you probably know, are the famous firms that grew out of Blackstone and others' efforts to buy up foreclosed homes during the financial crisis and turn them into a new class of commercial real estate of the single-family rental, which is, of course, one of the hottest growing areas right now in this. This is a slide I borrowed from Lennar, which has, of course, raised, I believe, $4 billion from Deutsche Bank and others to basically invest as well. Their whole argument here is that, of course, is like, the existing multifamily rental does not have the number of bedrooms that Americans require or desire in an era of remote and hybrid work. And so we're gonna have to basically build that out. And also, interestingly enough, and this is where I think things get really interesting with interest rates, is that Lennar pointed out at the time that there was a shortage of such assets because of the massive shortfall in home building following the global financial crisis. And I am talking to some friends in this business and thought about what happens as we continue to see this ratcheting of interest rates, which maybe will hopefully relent to an extent in 2024, but stay tight. What will that do to constrain the pipeline of new projects going forward? Will it only make housing even more expensive? So this is why you have the fascinating spectacle of Invitation Homes partnering with home builders. D.R. Horton, America's largest, also partnered with somebody to deliver 2,500 new homes, but literally turning single-family homes into a commercial asset class, which you can manage as a sort of fleet asset as well. The consulting project I worked on for Lennar that I showed you was actually sort of an analysis of their LenX tech portfolio, where they are actually developing not just tools to help smooth along contactless mortgages and things, but also thinking about acquiring the right companies for rooftop solar, wastewater management, more energy efficient appliances, et cetera, as it tries to seek about how do we basically run 7,500 or more homes in a more efficient manner and pass those savings back to the actual renters. So I think this is a sort of huge potential change, and one that from a public policy perspective, as someone who's worked at think tanks, bothers me a lot in some ways. It's one thing to argue, take the European argument that Americans should not invest their entire life savings in their homes. It's another thing when Blackstone and others are the ones who profit completely from home appreciation. So how will we build wealth in that kind of future? But when we're looking at this, when it comes to housing starts, builders are confident, even despite the interest rates in yesterday's FOMC meeting here, that basically we'll see a resurgence starting next year. And multifamily housing starts have also proven resilient as well here. So it'll be very interesting to see if this push can continue with higher rates given this. One area that's, of course, been mooted as to where we might find this new supply of housing, well, to quote the geographer David Harvey, a crisis is when you have, a surplus of one thing and a surplus of another, and you can't figure out how to put them back together. Well, we have a surplus of offices that are empty and a deficit of, of housing. Why don't we just convert all the offices? I think you know better than me why this can't happen. The floor plates, the plumbing, all these kinds of issues. But even more interesting, for me as an urbanist who wants to believe in this dream and there are some really interesting examples. CBRE ran the numbers. Even after the last 2 years of this incredible pressure, you see almost, number one, the trend lines are almost in line with past years and decades. And second, it still amounts to, 5,000 units a year. So the idea that we can very profitably and quickly take those urban cores and do that is perhaps an illusion. I will be interesting to see, we're seeing cities on the public policy side embrace this. Mayor Wu in Boston, for example, 75% tax break if you're able to do that. In New York, Mayor Adams, pushing for 20,000 units, where they're pushing with the new New York plan that will offer similar tax breaks. Could you do something like that in the district or in Baltimore or elsewhere? I think remains to be seen. But there's also a question of quality. If you'll pause here, she can certainly explain it better to me what some of the very early office to multifamily conversions have gone in the valley here, out in Silicon Valley.
You've probably been hearing they're converting a lot of office space into residential space to stop the economy from falling off a cliff, etc. But I've never seen it done so lazily as they did in this conversion in San Rafael. So we're at the Grand Landing, and we're looking at a 1,000 square foot apartment for $500,000. As a caffeine addict, I'm not complaining about the neighbors, but let's check inside. Oh boy, where to start? I think living here might be just as soul crushing, if not more soul crushing than working here.
We could go on and on. But I also think there's some really interesting programs that are happening here in the Mid-Atlantic when it comes to public-private partnerships of this. And I think this was a recent headline in the New York Times that I found really fascinating, that Montgomery County's HOC there is actually using its $100 million fund to simply direct invest in multifamily housing projects. And basically buying 70% stakes and using that to offer lower rents to affordable tenants. So that's this jokey headline, this public housing, just don't call it that because of course it's such a dirty word. But there's some really interesting potential here to basically partner directly with the public sector and think about how we can unlock some of those funds for a public good. And of course Montgomery County has not only done this for building new multifamily, but acquiring single-family homes that would have gone to large rental communities as well. So it'll be interesting. Solving that conundrum is going to be key, to say the least. Now, I want to talk about retail, of course, which I imagine is an area of focus and interest to you. So again, when it comes to, and I look at all these trends during the pandemic, I was one of the people who basically said that, to quote Don Draper from the first season of Mad Men, you'll be shocked at how fast this never happened, in the sense of things will snap back. One of the most, I think, wrong predictions was this idea that we were going to have a permanent turbocharging of e-commerce. This was going to be the final death knell in brick and mortar commerce. You can see here's JP Morgan doing its calculations during that. Whoops, not so much. Here's actual, data coming out of the Department of Commerce and Census showing that, that there was, of course, a burst, and then it has plateaued. People do, in fact, like shopping. And again, going back to the data seen there, this is from the McKinsey slides, that we've seen a change in foot traffic, that this surge of interest into suburban retail. And anecdotally, we could talk about how all major luxury brands, Gucci, Louis Vuitton, and others, going into suburban retail versus eschewing sort of classic urban cores. But the trend is not complete. This is one thing that really stands out to me. This is before the pandemic, well before the pandemic. Again, covering almost 30 years, almost 35 years of the American retail at this point. You can see how e-commerce and state ate away at the streets and storefronts of America. Newsstands and books, of course, Amazon's earliest victims. But you can sort of see how even supermarkets, even categories that we thought were sacrosanct, that would always be there to anchor, various shopping centers, have been slowly degrading. And so how will that continue from there? And how are those trends going to sort of combine? Now, during the ZIRP era that just ended, ZIRP is one of my favorite acronyms, zero interest rate phenomenon. One of the ZIRPs was the idea that we're going to have 15-minute delivery by bike messengers out of dead retail storefronts. That we were never going to leave our couches again, and you would just have a collection of ice cream bars and everything else delivered in 15 minutes. Well, all those companies, they're all but dead. Getter's the last one standing, more or less, just raised a final round, I think $500 million at a $2.5 billion valuation, down from about 13. Sorry, Getter. We also saw during this time that Walmart and others announcing these sort of new waves of automation in the stores. They're going to have robots to clean the shelves. I have not seen one of those lately. But we are seeing this kind of level of automation. We are seeing this sort of response to higher wages on the back end, sort of new interesting trends. Here's Walmart's, one of Walmart's super automated warehouses that they're investing in, the kind of logistics you would have seen a FedEx or UPS do a decade ago. You see Instacart, which of course just went public this very week, at a $10 billion valuation, got a nice pop. I didn't check the stock price today. I know it's been drifting back downward there. But it's interesting that Instacart, of course, at its peak was an army of 500,000 gig workers going to grocery stores and buying on behalf of customers. And what Instacart does today is a couple of things, one of which is it partners with existing retailers to create its Carrot warehouses. It's creating the UX interface and also help building out the back end to provide 15-minute delivery for existing people like Publix, in Miami in this case. And also investing in retail media. That basically a big chunk of Instacart's revenues are now and profits are now coming from advertising, from the advertising it offers through that. And I'll come back to that trend in a moment here about that sort of notion of these new touch points to retail customers and who's moving in on that. But I want to focus on automation and retail quickly here because it's interesting to see how that technology is trickling down out of like the really big players. So really fascinating use case. Nourish and Bloom it advertises itself as the first completely automated African-American-owned grocery store in the United States, if not the world. They're in Fayetteville, Georgia, just south of Atlanta. And two things. One, it uses the same sort of technology that Amazon pioneered to allow you to basically walk into a store, take what you want, and walk out. So completely automated, single store, and also uses some of those delivery bots there, which we'll come back to. And we're also seeing startups like SuperDuper. This is one that basically is using similar technology to what Amazon uses in its warehouses for the last 10 years to basically accelerate the picking and packing. So offering automated delivery as a service. And this, I think, is part of the trend that I think is really interesting, which is that sort of, that blurring of the line between retail and industrial. One of the things I thought that was really interesting during the pandemic was, of course, the many small businesses that, desperate to survive, there were restaurants started selling wine and food, not just delivery, but actually opening up retail emporium. This hybridization of it, and I think it's interesting to see that there's now startups that will allow smaller players to plug in and offer similar capabilities to have that hybrid retailing and delivery. Now, another trend that I think is really interesting is Shein. If you've been following, and if you have, I have two sons and they're not old enough to be out there buying fast fashion yet. But watching the rise of Shein and Temu as two of the fastest, most downloaded, most popular apps out there, offering their dirt cheap, faster than fast fashion. Well, Shein, of course, has recently announced a partnership, a tie-up with Forever 21 to basically open up Shein boutiques inside Forever 21. And also I think it's interesting that the owner of Forever 21 is Authentic Brands Group, which is, of course, one of their investors, is Simon, and this assemblage of retail brands into a verticalized experience. So why is this all important? Well, Shein ties into Instacart, and we'll tie into another example I'll give in a minute here, where I think one of the most significant acts, and it will become even more apparent as we go on, in the e-commerce landscape and online landscape, will be when Apple decided to totally screw Facebook by turning on the privacy to not allow Facebook to collect third-party data from its users. That changed everything. Not only did it force Mark Zuckerberg to get into the metaverse, which we'll see in a bit here, but also it has now created this rush of where can we get that data replacement? And so first-party data, as it's called, is key. Instacart is delivering for that on behalf of its customers through retail media. Shein and Temu do it by flooding the zone. What's the fastest way to get data on young people's shopping habits? Sell them the cheapest possible thing you can and harvest those data stores. And I think that's partly what ties up with Authentic Brands. And this notion of being able to basically take that Shein data, they invested, I think they bought something like close to, I have to see what the percentage is given the high value of Shein, but it was over $1 billion into it, investing into that to harness that data collection capabilities to feed back into its brand and its own retailing footprint. So I think that is a huge driver of this, which is the question of where are you going to get those touch points to deliver better advertising and deliver better experiences, and the results will shock you. But also, it's other interesting sort of hybrid trends that have emerged and thinking about these kind of holistic experiences. So John Mackey, of course, famous founder of Whole Foods, has been out of the game for a little bit after selling to Amazon. He's back by starting a new combined, what he thinks of as a food and healthcare company called Love Life. He bought the Love Life Cafe, famously in Wynwood in Miami. But what he's trying to do is offer an integrated medical care company that will address America's obesity crisis. And I think it's interesting that Mackey launched this right before Ozempic and Wegovy basically became the core of the Danish economy. If you've been following that whole story about the incredible success of those drugs and what they mean, and the fact that it's made Novo Nordisk the most richest company in Europe, is fascinating here. But it's this notion of how can we create an integrated offering that will address America's desire for health and wellness and dealing with obesity. So Mackey's figuring out how to roll this out into the next combination of this, where health optimized meals and juices. This is the Culver City location, their second one, which ties back to this because that Love Life is located in this development, Ivy Station, which is a new build mixed-use lifestyle center that is directly located on top of a transit stop in LA Metro in Culver City, which is, of course, where many millennials are moving with their children. You can see how it all connects when it happens like that. But these are the kinds of ultra-desirable locations that Mackey and others are scouting. And I also want to say another trend, I could talk all day about AI, in fact I was yesterday, but also we're starting to see some of the first companies that are coming out there. Better Blends is one that claims to be powered by AI, where they're offering mass individualized customization by using large language models to generate recipes on the fly on behalf of individual characteristics. So, instead of just set menus or create your own, well, here, the AI will tell you what you want based on your settings and preferences. So you can imagine how this concept can plug into Mackies and others to start offering, these kinds of new enticing combinations to people and offer mass choice. So I want to end the section quickly about sort of where are all these things going in this, and I think and we'll talk a bit about this a little bit more, is this idea that that for the last couple of years, people like me have talked about the 15-minute city, this idea that you should live in a dense urban core and walk or bike within 15 minutes to everything you need. Well, it's been supplemented by what SOM calls the 20-minute suburb, which is the idea that you'll have an activity nodes, but then of course you're going to have these sort of suburban clusters around it, and you might have other more sustainable forms of transportation, you see investments in cycling, etc. But this is like the kind of desirable hybrids that Americans want and are willing to pay for at this moment. And so some early examples of where that's going, of course, again, Mid-Atlantic, Virginia, and Maryland, you know how to build these better than anybody. But some examples I thought, this is Hilltop Mall in Richmond, California, bought during the pandemic by Prologis. This was on I-80 on the way out of the Bay Area towards Sacramento. It was interesting at the time, they announced they were going to actually seek a zoning variance to turn it into a combination of retail, housing, and industrial. I thought that was really fascinating that you would combine these kinds of functions. Well, you go to their website today, and what do you see? You see mixed-use district here. Create a mixed-use neighborhood that is a vibrant center of innovation, e-commerce, and business. I'd like to imagine here that you can move into multifamily housing on this site, and actually they'll offer, as Walmart and others have done, to do deliveries out of their ghost kitchens and warehouses in the base of the building right up to your apartment. You can start to imagine these kinds of integrated service offerings together. In Tempe, Arizona, Cul-de-sac is out there. This advertises itself as America's first built-from-scratch car-free neighborhood. One of the founding members of the Open Door team is heavily invested in this. And so, they basically, you cannot actually own a car on site at Cul-de-sac. You can't park it, you can't own it. They give you a mobility credit instead. There's a stop on the light rail for Metro Phoenix, but also they offer, basically, I think it was bird scooters at the time. I don't know if it's changed, but cycling and other amenities offered on site, and they take back the space that was parking and turn that into retail and other amenities for the tenants. So you can sort of see how that calculation is changing. And then there's a whole discussion too, about sort of what are we going to do with a lot of the sort of suburban landscapes? Do you retrofit it into galleries or into industrial space? Do you turn it into data centers, as we're seeing a lot of? And I think that's going to be a really interesting and fascinating challenge. I had a chance to talk about this again. I wish was here. I have some great examples from all across the country, and you have so many great here. But I had a chance to talk about this in person with Mark Toro, who developed Avalon. This, of course, is one of the most successful sort of lifestyle center nodes in Metro Atlanta. Mark's talked about the flight to quality. When it comes to this, the flight to life, the quality of living. And so he argues that actually because of, and this is a really interesting stance, and because, of course, of not just the lockdowns and stay-at-home orders that happened during the pandemic, but of course also the federal government keeping employees working from home, that those suburban locations where people moved to became more urban and more vibrant than actual urban centers. Perhaps it seems less shocking now as we're seeing the ramifications play out, but I do think it's interesting that what Mark is doing is putting his money where his mouth is by basically buying up dead suburban office parks. I find it fascinating overall, of all the sturm and drang that is placed around classy office buildings and dense urban nodes, when our landscapes were already littered with dead office parks, many of which you've worked on in this and resuscitated them into beautiful new urban nodes. So this is the State Farm that he bought out there in the exurbs of Virginia. I've talked to Ralph Zuckerman at Somerset Development. There's so many dead AT&T office parks around the country alone that he's able to actually create a new chain of live workspaces called Bellworks. You can literally just brand it around the dead AT&T ones. So that shows the level of opportunity that's in all of this to create these nodes. And there was just a piece I was reading, in Commercial Observer, that basically right now you're either going to take these kinds of places and rebuild them, demolish and turn them into these kinds of mixed-use districts, or they're going to be turned into data centers, or some even lower energy, lower use. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But I want to talk about autonomy in this one, just getting into some of the technology sections here. It's really trendy to talk about autonomous cars. And I just saw this whole discussion about, Brad Hargreaves, who founded Common, the co-living chain, who's now invested in various prop tech ventures, was talking about if he had to choose a growth market, he would look at some of these smaller towns in the Mid-Atlantic and the American South, and he would say, and he pointed out today that I would look at places that would benefit from an autonomous vehicle premium that would reduce those commute times. That is an interesting logic, and we've been talking about it for 10 years, and I am not sure it's going to pan out, because of course, we've been talking about what autonomous vehicles would do 50 years ago. The only difference between that vision and this one is the dominoes are missing, and they would probably be playing on their phones, let's be honest here. But this is literally a rendering screenshot from Cruise, General Motors' autonomy division, and this is the vehicle that they claim they're about to get approval from, or at least an exemption from NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, to test this out. No steering wheels, no drivers, no nothing. This is how it's going for Cruise right now in San Francisco. I don't think they're going to get approval, do you? And this is the joke one, but the more serious one, as you can sort of see here, here's what happened to them in North Beach the other night. The more serious one is that at least one person has died from autonomous vehicles indirectly because during this kind of shutdown it blocked emergency vehicles. And so in the ultimate irony, a pedestrian who was hit by a car and died of his injuries could not get to the hospital in time because of this. I think it's interesting because what you're seeing here is actually not a failure of the vehicles, just quickly. It's actually a success. I worked with Ford on writing their guidelines for NHTSA, and there's a lot of jargon, but they have this notion of the domain operation environment, and it's designed that when you exceed your environment, when the car is no longer what to do, is to fail very safely. In this case, the reason they failed, there was a Beyonce concert, and the cell networks were overwhelmed with traffic, and so the cars lost instructions and shut down. Wow. So there you go. That's our autonomous future in some ways. And this is why I think, that after 10 years, the autonomous dream is starting to curdle a little bit when you see in surveys, people are starting to worry about this sort of stuff. But just as a background to this, and again, this is, I think, a huge thing here, and also even further south in the United States, is the effects of the IRA in just the last year are beyond incredible when it comes to the level of investment that's going into the electrification and decarbonization of the American economy, at least when it comes to building cars and batteries and solar panels and all these sorts of things. I was just in New York this week for Climate Week, and it feels like CES. There's parties everywhere. Startups are roaming all around town. There's so much money to be out there. And you see people like Tom Steyer has just raised another $1 billion for his fund on this. So here you can see how it's going to change the view for vehicles. You can see how quickly Americans are doing adoption of electric cars. The tailwinds are there when it comes to this. And again, this is how this is going to play out in American suburban environments. We see retailers like Starbucks and Walmart announcing they want to be the charging stations of the future. Have that dwell time. You cannot refill it as fast as a tank of gas. So how do you basically take your gas station and turn it into a third place? This is a huge opportunity for this as we basically try to retrofit American suburbia and make it greener. But I also want to touch upon the fact that the reason the car companies are so plowing so much money into this and borrowing billions of dollars from the government is there is a bit of a stealth reason as well. And this goes back exactly what I was talking about first-party data. The Mozilla Foundation, which makes the Firefox browser, just came out with a great study that shows that every automaker they looked at, 26 of them, are some of the most privacy-guzzling companies, data-guzzling, privacy-ignoring companies they've ever seen. All of them got failing marks on their privacy. And the worst of all, was Tesla, which was the worst company they'd literally ever seen in this. And the reason why is that these companies are collecting data from your cars, they are selling it, they are sharing it, they're putting it out there because, as Jim Hackett said when he was CEO of Ford, we have more data troves than anybody. You should see what you put on your car financing application. Your marriage, your debt levels, your mortgage, all this sort of stuff. And basically, companies are desperate to get that kind of replacement data that they can't get from their phones anymore. The idea that an autonomous electric car is a computer on wheels is taken to its natural extreme. And I always point out here in this one, what you're seeing here is the successfully awarded patent to Ford Motor to allow the remote repossession of vehicles with the advent of missing payments. So if you miss it, you don't need a repo man, your F-150 will repossess itself. We're making great progress out here. But I want to touch upon quickly also how we can change environments. And going back to retail, the craziest talk I've ever heard about the future of autonomy was about 10 years ago at the Googleplex. Astro Teller was it was their captain of moonshots, running the self-driving car program before they spun it out to Waymo. And he said this line, "We might need self-driving buildings as well as self-driving cars." I thought it was nuts at the time, and then it hit me like a lightning bolt. Because autonomy, just like any other technology subject to Moore's law, gets smaller and less costly over time. The first Google cars had $80,000 LiDAR arrays on top of them. Anybody in this room with an iPhone 13, 14, or 15, if you manage to get your hands on one, has the same kind of technology mounted in your phone that Apple is just basically giving away and trying to find developers use for it. Some of which will go into the Apple Vision Pro, which we'll talk about. But in this case, do you need a self-driving car? That's like the horseless carriage of mobility. What about a self-driving school bus? This was a partnership in Florida, Tavistock, the developer of Babcock Ranch, Kitson's the developer of Babcock Ranch. In this case, they partnered with Transdev, the French mobility giant, to turn a school bus into a 6-person, basically rolling classroom as it took the kids to school. So what I thought was interesting is this idea that you could take the school itself and disaggregate it. You could deliver the first lesson of the day to the doorstep of the students. Everything was going great until NHTSA sent them a cease and desist letter saying, your experimental permit does not allow you to experiment on children. That was a very good point. But you can see here, that's still like the outlier here. Why would you have a multi-thousand-pound vehicle doing these kind of deliveries? You can have something much smaller. And so as we saw with Nourishing Bloom and others, I do think it's interesting that, that even going through the ZIRP winter here, Starship, which now has 50,000 vehicles on more than 200 US college campuses, is creating the delivery of the future. And starting with college kids is brilliant, of course, because of course college campus is the kind of pedestrianized, non-traffic mixed environment where these kinds of cute vehicles will flourish, and of course dealing with hungry college students in the middle of the night. Of course, they're of course not foolproof either. Mishaps happen. Better the robot get caught there. But that's also why, just as an aside here, we're seeing a lot of investment in teleoperation. When this stuff breaks through, we might actually do see autonomous vehicles happen. It'll be because you have all sorts of remote drivers. I'll leave it aside for now, but I think it'll be very interesting to see what gets chalked up to technology and AI is actually going to be because of people hiding behind the curtain. But all these kinds of technologies, whether it's remote teleoperation or true autonomy, is going to require big investments in bandwidth, in what's called edge compute and others. I've done some work with Verizon and AWS. I'm thinking through how this gets played out at urban scale. They've partnered with 13 cities across the United States, one of which is right here, over there at National Landing. I know, obviously, JBG Smith has been putting a pause on some of its projects, but they're very proud of the fact that they're putting in, of course, top-flight Wi-Fi, not just public 5G, but private 5G spectrum that they've purchased and set aside for clients like Amazon to deliver that ultra-low latency environment. For 15 years, we've talked about smart cities, and now we're on the cusp of actually trying to create the actual underlying tech that will allow it to happen. And what I liked about it when I talked with them is they were the first people in 15 years of covering this and talking to Cisco and others, where they were like, we're just going to invite people to come in and play with it. We are not going to try to come up with solutions. I'll never forget being in Korea in 2009 when Cisco's chief globalization officer tried to sell me on the idea that we would use that basically we would collect data from our morning constitutionals to help with our health access. I don't think that was ever going to catch on in the States, maybe big in Korea. But there's still, it's still an interesting time to do experiments and figure out where that goes. All right, so I have a little time left. I want to get a little dark here on you real fast, because I think it's absolutely necessary, particularly during Climate Week, to talk about the ramifications of climate and also potential opportunities. So if you ever want a good general purpose, one sentence prediction of the future that is guaranteed to pan out, Bruce Sterling, the science fiction author, came up with Old People in Cities Frightened of the Sky. There you can sort of see the combination of demography. Almost every society on the planet is aging. The United States barely outlasted immigration. Of course, India is still surging. Cities, massive growth in urbanization that's happening, and then frightened of the sky, the climate disasters, which now seem to rain down on us with even faster and faster tempo all the time. I am an advisor to a startup called Climate Alpha that's currently speaking in New York at Climate Week. Our founder, Parag Khan, and I wrote op-eds. He wrote a book about this as well. We basically made the argument that, that climate migration is going to be the megatrend of perhaps the first half of this century, if we look out several decades. And America, for decades, because of those qualities of life that we talked about, have been moving what might turn out to be in the wrong direction into the Sun Belt. And we see now that basically people are continuing to move at higher and higher speeds. This is Redfin data here. That basically the higher the risk, the more people have moved into it. Because in part of that housing affordability that I talked about earlier, places like Phoenix, places like Florida, these are some of the, places like Texas, the most climate-stressed regions, are also attracting the most people. And how does that play out is anybody's question. In 2016, Sean McKinney, who was then the chief economist of Freddie Mac, published an explosive blog piece where he basically looked at this and said, will we, when this data becomes apparent in price signals, will we see an orderly repricing of risk in the market, or will we see opportunistic early sellers followed by a stampede for the exits? Well, I'm an American, so I know that opportunism and panic is what we do best, so I definitely would pick the latter. And in economics literature, this is what's known as a Minsky moment after Hyman Minsky. This is what happened during the global financial crisis, where all those subprime mortgages looked absolutely great until they didn't. And of course, we can look at savings and loans when you go further back with commercial real estate, and also looking at all of that commercial real estate debt sitting on the books of small lenders across the United States. But we argued here is that perhaps the next Minsky moment will be that climate repricing, where suddenly all at once, a lot of that coastal Florida real estate is not worth what you thought it was. And there's a handful out there who agree with us. One of our customers is Nouriel Roubini, who you may know as Dr. Doom. Roubini called the global financial crisis and is basically right now building a new ETF that combines climate resilient real estate and gold and crypto. He's trying to create the ultimate post-disaster portfolio, among other things. But in that, we think there's opportunities as well, because in our climate analysis data that we built at Climate Alpha, which we combine climate models and hardcore data with socioeconomic variables to not just test like where the hurricanes will hit, but also what communities are best positioned to resist them and to adapt and to invest in infrastructure. Find is, well, number one, like some places that are supposed to be doomed are not as doomed as we thought, and number two, people don't move across the country in the end following a climate disaster. They don't pick up stakes and move to Vermont, which is supposedly the most climate resilient state in the union, but also had ruinous floods. They move inland. They look at areas of opportunity that are nearby. And the Mid-Atlantic actually is well positioned in that regard. Perhaps you have to move away from some of the areas that are most prone to sea level rise, but there's still many great opportunities. We did an analysis of tomorrow's Zoom towns and actually found that coastal Virginia had several counties that were highly desirable. And so we've taken part of that, we put it into our subsidiary product, Climate Homes here. And what I think is interesting, so I just took this zip code, and it actually shows that, yeah, until 2040, where we're sitting right now is actually going to appreciate more because of climate change. And once you factor in what we call the climate price, it'll actually make out okay. So I think there's some actually interesting opportunities here. And this goes back into development and real estate, because again, you ask American mayors, this is the annual Menino survey, over 800 American mayors, about what are the tools they have to fight climate change. Influence over building codes, influence over zoning. How do we basically fight the NIMBYism? How do we allow more building in climate resilient areas and more dense housing in those places to reduce our carbon emissions overall? So I think it's one of we have these incredible tools at our fingertips here if we can figure out how to use them to push forward and build out our areas. All right, so finally I want to end with a bit of candy. Well, maybe dystopic candy. Because I do think it's interesting, just as a sort of, I mentioned obviously the pandemic, it sort of lingers with me obviously. I mean, I have, the friends I was going to stay with tonight have COVID, so I've had to change of plans myself. But I think about things like Zuck and this vision, right? This idea that we're all gonna go live in the metaverse. It's such a fascinating artifact of a time where we were all gonna be stuck inside our homes forever. And there's actually, tying these two together, there is this idea that, well, if we were going to live in the metaverse all the time because of the pandemic, well, maybe now we'll live in the metaverse all the time because of wildfire smoke making it impossible to go outside. But it would be interesting to see, if we transition from that vision or from Apple's even higher, glossier, sleeker one here, this idea of spatial computing, how does it get projected out into the real world? I thought about this. Who in this room remembers Pokemon Go from 2016? Anyone play it? Anyone use it? Pokemon Go is fascinating. A game made by Niantic. The most fascinating thing about Pokemon Go is that there's actually an academic paper by researchers at Purdue that estimate that 30,000 pedestrians and other motorists were harmed by distracted drivers playing the game while driving on their phones. Can you imagine driving while hunting Pikachu? If you can't imagine it, don't tell me. But it's this idea that augmented reality almost broke through for a moment. You saw this craziness in 2016, but what happens when it comes back at scale? What if Zuckerberg is right? Or Apple is right? Or what if that technology, instead of bringing you into the metaverse, goes out into the world? Well, this is a short film from 2016 called Hyperreality. Keiichi Matsuda, an artist, filmmaker, developer of these experiences, that he imagined a day in the life in Medellin in 2030. My favorite is the giant cat in the background here, but look at the possibilities for advertising, for retailing, for wayfinding, of guiding you to actual places. This video has it all, and it's still regularly referenced by executives at Google and Apple and Snap as really like their version of Futurama. And like I said, Keiichi's building it for real. Niantic, which makes Pokemon Go, hired him to build this. You're looking at actual, through his cell phone, their developer event from last year here, imagining what he calls reality channels. That we will take the physical built environment and we will overlay not just a metaverse on top of it, but infinite amounts potentially of different worlds. And so you can imagine, you can just literally, there's a scene here where you can literally flip through them, imagine the kinds of experiences that are on offer there. And this, in this case, it means located, geosynced to the actual location. So you can go out in the world and discover various experiences. There you go, you can sort of see some of the wayfinding stuff. Now take that, let's tie it together with the other, other obsession du jour at the moment. The metaverse was very trendy in 2022 until ChatGPT came along, and then that's all we could talk about. But one of the latest demos that Keiichi has worked on, again with Niantic, is Wool. I met Wool in June this year, and it was, to me, one of the most powerful technology demos I've ever seen. Wool is an artificially intelligent owl. Here he comes. And if I had the sound on, he would sit there and talk to you about the redwood forest. or about anything you want. I actually asked him who his friends were, and he said, oh, I've got lots of friends, but Freddie the Bat and I like to do karaoke at night where the other animals are asleep. To which I immediately responded while wearing the headset, I'm like, that's amazing. Well, like, what songs do you like to sing? He's like, oh, I really like the Eagles. They're a hoot. And I'm like, you built an AI that can do dad jokes? It's amazing. But these are the kind of experiences I think about where, and this is Keiichi's point too, is that like the real interface for AI is not going to be these chatbots that we're doing with right now, or putting in prompts into ChatGPT and figuring out like what it can do for us. It's going to be talking to animal spirits and whoever else comes along. Imagine your kid having their own best friend of Taylor Swift, and everybody has one of T Swift, who's an AI instance. This is what Keiichi's working on now. This is his newest concept called agents. We're imagining that, yeah, the world will be enchanted. You might actually have, whether it's a headset or your phone or some other interface that provides there, this idea that like, they will all have AIs as our friends and they'll be there with us. What happens then? Like, how does that world get enchanted? And if that seems a little bit far out, there's actual demos today of this. So I was just hosting a session in New York at the Fast Company Innovation Festival on the future of the barcode, the evolution of the QR code, and of course what that does to inventory management. We were able to, be able to know in real time where any object is in any given store. Take that and combine that with this actual existing demo with AR, where you can like literally just walk with your phone and be guided on any given path. Like taking that universal access of e-commerce, the ability to search for anything, while now being able to do it in physical space and not have to wander around the aisles here, lowering that friction even further to make brick and mortar retail even more desirable. These are the kinds of things I think would be really interesting when it unlocks this, when you're able to go out into a city and find that one cool thing. Show me where this thing is. I was talking about this as an aside with Dennis Crowley, who founded Foursquare. If you remember that app, it's the location analysis tool that allowed you to become mayor of various places. He gamified location data, which Apple now uses to predict first-day iPhone sales based on the lines outside the stores. Dennis argues, he's like, yeah, that's my actual dream. He's like, I've got a lot of eBay alerts set up for these weird, cool things that I want to find. What if that happened at city scale, where suddenly I'm triggered an alarm to know that this thing is there, I can go find it in the world? That's the kind of powers we're going to unlock. And here's an example too, also of AI and AR in terms of what it does for F&B dining.
What should we drink?
How about some wine?
Wine sounds great.
I don't know how well you can see it. I'll pause in a second here.
It's a good wine for a hot summer's day.
It's going to recommend a Cabernet, but in that case, they were using a monocle by Brilliant Labs. It's a $300 monocle that has a high-definition camera mounted on it, which has ChatGPT integration. So right now, you can put that on your sunglasses and actually have a conversation with ChatGPT as it would bring up recommendations for you. Now, the question for that is, what remains to be seen is that more or less obnoxious than playing on your phone the whole time with your friends? I guess we'll find out. But it also, again, the AR also opens up some really interesting opportunities. I thought this is fun. Snap, which is getting heavily into AR, partner with Bolt to actually sort of see, what if we could make cars disappear? And we could sort of see what outdoor dining could look like in this location. We're gonna have incredible new tools to visualize and co-create our cities. And I left out a slide here, but one of the most interesting startups that I've worked with in this out of my project at Cornell Tech is called In-Situ. They use your phones and augmented reality to show you building envelopes of future projects. They have actually created a formal partnership here at Washington, D.C. with the DOB there. If you know Ernest Chapa, who just left as the head of DOB, partnering there to basically use it to help do civic engagement, to show people in situ, in location, this is what the building will look like. Because we know NIMBYism is the bane of so many projects, of people not knowing what they want, but they know they don't want you to build anything near them, goddammit. And so, this ability to actually show with their own phones, this is how it will resemble, and being able to talk about it is a real gamble that we can use this technology for community engagement. And then finally, the question is again, going back to this notion of how do we bring people back into cities, or how do we get football into office districts? There's this idea, of course, that we can deeply intensify these experiences. And so this is an example I'll play for you. You'll hear the music in a second, but Google, using its AR Core Kit to build a virtual map of reality, partnered with Gorillaz, the band here, to basically turn all of Times Square into a massive outdoor conference. You get the idea here of what's possible in this, of re-enchanting the world. So I know I've shown a lot, I've talked a lot, various visions of this as we sort of think about these sort of desires, of course, to be back in the world, but also, of course, to have that convenience, to have space, but yet be around people. I think it's really interesting how these conflicting desires and trends come together, but I'm hopeful, most hopeful, that the trend that proceeded before the pandemic, that people want to be around other people, that they want to have walkable places, even though they want to have space, will continue, and that this continues to be the ground zero of that the projects of the last half decade will continue to evolve with these new technologies, that AR will make them richer and denser, that delivery robots will be able to extend their reach, and that we'll actually see continued success and resurgence here in Northern Virginia, Maryland, and so forth. So on that note, I think I have a few minutes for questions, so thank you so much.
Thank you, Greg. If any